In this video, we're going to be building the JA-37 Saab Viggen. It's a delta wing flyer with forward canards. The first step is really laying out the plans and cutting out all the different parts. I just use scissors or an X-Acto knife, and we just trim around. We want to leave a little edge, maybe a ½ inch or 12 millimeters around the edge of each part, and we just set those off to the side. Some of the parts we may not use, depending on if we use 3D printed parts, which I do highly recommend printing out anything that you need. If you have 3D printing capabilities, it really helps with shaping the model. And the other thing that it does is it adds a little bit of durability, on the nose cone, for instance, areas of the plane that might take a little more damage. Once we've cut everything out, we can go ahead and put some spray adhesive on the back of the parts, and we'll do this one at a time. And here I'm doing the main, wing section. And what I do is I just gently coat it, get it tacky, and then I'll lay it down on top of the foam. And you can work with it and reposition it, but what we want is it to be, straight and completely covering the foam. And I just, make that down onto the foam, make sure it's nice and smooth so that I can come back with my X-Acto blade. And you could freehand this, but I use a metal straight edge, and what that does is as I take the blade, it gives me a guide. I just line it up with the line, and then I keep the blade at about a 45-degree angle, and that helps with the cutting. It keeps me from tearing the foam, and as the blade gets dull, we'll replace that. So in cutting out a plane, for instance, we'll replace maybe 2 or 3 blades at least while we're cutting this out. So as we go through, we just start cutting this out, again, lining up the straight edge, and then just cutting around all the parts. Where there is an area like a curve or something, you can actually cut a little wider and, just trim around it and slowly work yourself, in around that curve. Or you could, maybe freehand around the curve, if you've got those kind of cutting skills, surgical cutting skills. So I cut everything out, and again, I just, spray adhesive, and I just do it one at a time, and I leave the paper on the foam, tacked to the foam. 2 things: it's easier to pull off later as the glue kind of sets up and dries. It's not as sticky. It'll peel off easy. The other thing is it helps me identify the parts later that I'll need. So the first real assembly part is going to be Bulkhead 2 and the servo tray, and then the fuselage sides. So we're just going to take Bulkhead 2 and the servo tray, and I'm going to put glue on the servo tray just where it's going to touch the bulkhead, and just make sure it's a foam safe glue. And I'll then just put that right into the cutout. It should fit perfectly, and we just slide that right in, and the friction of those 2 pieces should hold it in place until it dries. The fuselage sides, the 2 forward side panels, what we want to do is we're going to mark on the foam where the line is, where that goes. There's not a slot for it to fit into, so we just want to take a pen or a black marker. We'll go through. I just make some marks on each piece where that's going to line up, and any other markings, throughout the build where we do this, you'll see markings on the pieces. This is where leaving the paper on helps. And what I'm going to do is, as I mark that, it gives me a guide of where I'm going to place bulkhead number 2. The other thing is we have the canards and where those have to go, and I'm going to mark those cutout holes as well, for the carbon rod that goes through there later. Once I've done that, I'm going to put some glue on the sides of bulkhead 2, and again, I'm just going to, it doesn't take much, I'm just going to smear it a little bit on there, and I use the tip of the glue to kind of, as I squirt a little out, I drag it and smooth it around with the tip there. So I'm not really putting extra glue on. I just make sure the whole piece is covered. And once I do that, then I'm gonna take those marks that I made, those lines, and I've got the pieces laid out mirrored. Make sure they're going in the right direction. We want the servo tray going aft in the fuselage sides, and we just line that up. And to make it a little easier, I move, like I said, I move the marks to where I can see them. I can just lay that piece right on the side panel. Then I can take the second piece and line it up as well. Once I've done that, I do have a few minutes to work with it. So what I do next is I stand it upright. I can take some straight pins, some T-pins, and once it's lined up, I'll put those pins through the side to hold it in place. I put glue on the back as well. This is the back edge of this that's going to be hidden back by the fan unit. We're building the EDF version in this, and what we're going to do is make sure that there's glue in the back, and we're going to squeeze that together. I don't like to use clamps on the foam. It depresses it, so I just use pins there as well. Then we're going to add bulkhead 1 in the fuselage bottom, and this is really going to give it some structure. So just at the front of the fuselage side panels, we're just going to put glue on the edges where it's going to touch those panels. And once I do that, I'm just going to squeeze it, just much like bulkhead 2. I'm just going to squeeze that in place between the two sides, and put a couple pins on each side to just keep pressure in. With the pins, I put them at an angle. That way they don't just pull out. The foam won't just pull out of the side. It creates a pressure, kind of like a clamping action between the two pieces if you put them in at angles. And once I've got that pinned in place, I'm going to take the bottom, make sure I line it up. We want the kind of the notch that's sticking out to go backwards. That's going to align with the wing itself. And once I line that up, I glue it in place, and I'll make sure that the sides, everything's lined up and touching, and then I will pin it to keep it from moving, and also to keep it tight onto the side panels. And one note that you don't see me do here, I actually do it later. I missed this step. We're going to take a 10 millimeter strip and put that on the inside of the bottom edge. We're going to do 2 of those on each side on the inside. So just it'll end up being 12 millimeters wide, 2 6 millimeter thick pieces, but 10 millimeters tall, and we're just going to line the bottom inside edge. There are notches on the bulkheads, bulkhead 1 and bulkhead 2, to do that. Now the canopy side supports and the canopy front supports are going to give more rigidity to the front area of the plane where we're housing the battery. It's also going to provide the structure, a little bit of shape and appearance, but also provide the structure to essentially lock the canopy down onto the aircraft. So we're just going to put glue on the sides, make sure that you have them opposite of each other, and I just smear the glue around so it's touching all areas of the surface. Once I get that saturated, I'm just going to line that up, and it has a little notch that sticks up, and I line that up and I keep the edge flush, and there is kind of a curved piece that will stick up. We want that. That will aid in the shaping, and give us more of a scale appearance later. And then I pin that again, put my pins at an angle, and I just pin that in place to hold it until the glue cures. And then the forward canopy supports, we just glue those pieces in. The first one, goes in between the two side bulkheads and the side supports, and then we have the smaller pieces. We just saturate those with glue again, and I make sure anywhere where foam is touching foam, I cover it with glue, and I put those down. These are going to be sanded, later, and help provide shape, from the nose cone of the aircraft. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing where there's extra foam or we build up foam, we're going to be sanding that away later. And now that we've got that area, we're going to continue moving forward with the nose cone alignment and the nose cone itself. The nose cone aligner is just a really small piece of foam, and we glue that, and there's a hole in bulkhead 1 that will slide into and pretty much lock it into place. The nose cone itself, you could make out of multiple pieces of foam and then sand it to shape, or you could 3D print one. Again, the 3D printing does add weight to the aircraft, but if you print in lightweight PLA, it's really not a significant amount of weight. Here I've 3D printed it. You can see the shape is well defined. It's lightweight PLA is really smooth, so there's not a lot of processing work, and it will almost have the same texture as the foam. And I just put the glue inside there, and I also put glue on the back face, because not only do I want it to hold, on the alignment piece, but I want it to be glued to the front face of bulkhead 1 there on the fuselage. I just line that up, and in this case, the pressure is, it's such a good fit that it holds itself in place. You could wrap some tape around it and hold it, but in this case, I didn't have to. And now that we have the nose cone on, we can finish up the cockpit area of the plane by gluing in the magnet tray. And that's just, a strip of foam that's cut to fit, and there's kind of a guide in the back up against bulkhead 2. We're just going to glue the edges of the foam, and then we're going to just lay that in place between the fuselage sides and bulkhead 2 here. And now we're going to work on the wing and glue the carbon rod into the wing using some epoxy mixture. And the first step, to really get a smooth finish, we're going to put a piece of tape across the bottom, whichever side you decide is going to be the bottom. I put a piece of tape across the bottom. Make sure it's tight onto the foam. And this is going to keep the epoxy in the slot for the carbon rod, but it's also going to give us a really nice smooth finish for the epoxy. And then what I'm going to do on the other side is I'm going to lay tape on each side of the slot. I'm just going to line it up right with the edge. And what this is going to do is it's going to prevent the epoxy, any overage, from adhering or marring the finish of the foam. It would peel some foam off or something later if we let it cure, and it would just make it harder to work with. So I make sure that the foam is completely covered. Then I trial fit the rod. Once I know the rod fits, I mix up some epoxy, and I'll just dab, some epoxy into the slot, and I'll make sure that that's, spread out, across the slot. It doesn't take a lot of epoxy to do this. The rod's going to fill up, 80% of the slot. We're just making sure that this, adheres the rod to the foam and gives it a nice bonding surface. And if as I pressed it in there, I made sure that I kind of rotated it around. And then what I can do is, as the epoxy oozes up, I just go back, and because of the tape, I can just smear that across. And then I lay a piece of tape across the top. That's going to give me a nice smooth finish to work with when that cures. And this is 5-minute epoxy, so I don't have a lot of working time. When it's done, just in 5 minutes, I can peel the tape off, and some may stick, but just peel it off. It should peel off pretty easily. The adhesive allows it to release from the epoxy. And we do that, and then I take some of my lightweight spackle, and I will spread that out over the surface of the carbon rod and the slot, and any imperfection from the epoxy, if there was a bubble hole or maybe a sag in the epoxy, this will go in and just fill those gaps before we continue the assembly. So I just spread that out evenly over the surface and just make sure it's nice and smooth. And while we're at this stage of the build, this is a really good opportunity to replace the leading edges of the foam and give them a little bit more protection. So whether it's from landings or transport or storage, we can replace the leading edge with a piece of balsa wood or a 3D printed, a lightweight 3D printed part. And what I do is, this is usually a shaped kind of an airfoil leading edge piece. And it's 6 millimeters, in thickness, or 1/4 inch, and I will measure how deep that is into the foam, and then I will trim the foam away with my straight edge and the X-Acto blade. I'll do that, across the entire, leading edge of the wing on both sides. And on this particular aircraft, there is like these pods that stick out of the wing, and we've cut those out, in the shape of the foam. But I've, from the Jetworks site, 3D printed kind of a more shaped piece that was available on the site, and I've printed that out, and then I'm just going to measure, where that would come to on the foam, and I'm gonna make some marks, and then I will come back and I will actually cut that shaped, pod that's protruding from the leading edge of the wing. I will just cut that out, and then I will glue in the 3D printed piece at this stage. Because I'm replacing the leading edge of the wing, I want everything to kind of line up and touch, so I don't have to come back and fill later. So I'll do that now. And you can see I just cut a kind of a square, which is the base of the 3D printed part, and then I can put some glue on the edges where that would touch, and then I can just lay that in. And I'll do that, this process for both sides, and just glue on the edge and let it dry. And now we'll take our leading edge and we'll add it to the front of the wing, and I just put some glue on there and then place it. And what I'll do is trim it to fit first. So I'll lay it in place, and then I'll just cut at a right angle with my X-Acto knife. I'll just cut that off. Then I'll do that with each successive piece that I put on the wing. So then I take some glue and apply it, and then place it to the wing, and I'll actually tape these in place and to hold them even with the front edge or the leading edge of the wing. And as we tape this on, this will clean up the front edge if we had an imperfect cut. It will also strengthen the tip. When we land or travel with the plane, any dings or leading edge scuffs will go away. And we just want to do this on both sides of the airframe and let that dry. And once we're done with that, we can go ahead and add the wing to the airframe, the forward fuselage section. And we're just going to put glue on the underside of the fuselage everywhere where it's going to touch the wing. And I just run a bead of glue along the edges there. And then I'll also put it on the mating surface of the fuselage bottom piece. And anywhere where there's contact, we want to make sure that's glued in place. And then we can just lay that in. If it's on a flat surface, we just lay that down. You'll see that fits, and make sure we cover everything so there's a spot on each side here where it touches. We're just going to make sure there's glue there. Then we'll just lay that right in, and it'll snap in like a puzzle piece. And once that's in place, we can put weight over the top to hold it down. I also use pins to keep it straight, just in case it gets, it moves somehow. But I'll pin it a couple times just to hold it, and then I'll weight it down. And now that we really have an aircraft that's starting to look like the Viggen, we're going to add our power plant. And if you're doing a pusher, then that's one option. In this case, we're using the EDF, so we're going to fit that into the bulkheads here. And we'll have to trim and cut. And the thing to remember is that we want it to be snug, but not too tight. And you can actually see that if you do make a mistake here, we can fix that. This is all going to be hot glued in place, and we're going to make sure that this is attached to those two bulkhead pieces with plenty of hot glue so that it doesn't move. It's going to be under a tremendous amount of force and torque from the engine rotation. So I just make sure it's lined up with the holes that were cut out and slide it in place in preparation to glue it. And now we'll take our hot glue gun and we will run a bead of glue everywhere we can that we can get to, and we'll run that bead of glue completely around on the inside edge there where it touches the foam. And I'll just run it completely around. And it really doesn't take much glue when we're gluing the EDF to the foam. We're going to hit it. Both pieces of foam are going to get glued here, and the front and back of each side. Maybe it's overkill, but it is the main source of power. And like I said, it's under a lot of torque, and there's a lot of pull on this, so we don't want it to move. And once we're done installing the EDF, this is where we'd put the exhaust bulkhead in. We'd put that right on the back and mount it there. In this case, I'm going to use the 3D printed tail and exhaust. That's kind of all in one. And I recommend this. It really helps shape the fuselage later. And now we can attach the fuselage sides and then the elevons, the servos, and the radio gear into the model. So first with the sides, like everything else, we're going to apply a bead of glue along the surface where it's going to touch the airframe and the wing in this case. And I'll just put a bead of glue across the bottom here. And make sure you glue the correct side, and we'll just put that in place. And there's the guide holes, and then we also have the mating surface to the EDF, so it will touch the bulkheads of the EDF mount will touch the side pieces, and then we'll make sure it lines up in the front, and it kind of will have a curve to it. It will curve outwards as it moves forward, and then it will curve back in at the entrance of the engine intake. And I'll just pin this in place from the underside, and that will help guide it to the curve. And I just use the center, the fuselage section in the center here as the kind of my guide to keep it aligned. And we can do that for both sides on this step at the same time. There's no harm. It actually might actually help keeping things centered with the engine and any pinning or twist as the glue dries. And since we're going to crowd the space with electronics, now is a good time to install the 3D printed intake. This will go between the EDF unit and the fuselage, and I just put glue all around the edges where it's going to touch any foam, and just a bead of glue, and then that will just sit in place right up against the EDF unit and the foam. And then the forward side of that will touch the back edge of the fuselage, and then the sides will be against the fuselage sides there. And once that's saturated, like I said, I just place that in. And I'm doing this now because I'm going to be installing electronics, so I'm going to have the speed controller and servo wires running through here, and I just want to get make sure I'm not struggling with wiring later when to get this to fit. So getting this in now, and then I can always cut a notch or sort out where this actually has to go. And that really doesn't take much effort. The foam kind of wedges it in and holds it in place to dry right up against that front edge of the EDF. Then I'm going to install the servo for the forward canard here, and I'm just going to fit that in place for now. And I'm not gluing anything in place at this time, as far as the radio is concerned. I'm just going to trial fit everything, and then I'll do the servos. And like I said, I put that intake, that 3D printed intake in place just because of what you see here, trying to figure out the wiring and how I'll get the wiring to go. So I just slide those servos in and sort out, where the wires will be. I'll also have to figure out, where the the EDF goes, or the ESC, the speed controller goes, and all this, and how the wires will go forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the wires over the top of that intake, and then I'll bring them right down into the right down into the fuselage section. Now with the EDF, a couple things. One, I want to make sure that it is hooked up correctly and it blows the engine in the right direction. And then I also need to sort out where I'm going to place the EDF, because we need it to stay cool, so it needs to have airflow. So what I'm going to do is make sure that the wiring fits through. Also, I'll cut a small little notch out here, but then on the left side I'm going to have that sitting on the top because it's going to get to the wiring. Alternately, you could run the wires from the engine on the bottom. You could run them down and then just lay the EDF, or the ESC. You could lay that in the bottom underneath, just forward of that 3D printed part. That would work just as easily. And this is where planning helps considerably. So I just cut little notches here for the wires, and then when I'm ready, I'll come back and I'll glue everything in place, but I'll be able to glue this to hold it in place. You can see it's going to get plenty of airflow now on the intake, and then everything will make it up to the receiver. If we're building the pusher version, we'd install the motor mount now. Otherwise, we're going to move on and install the Canard support and the support tube. So that's just going to slide through the holes that we cut when we cut this out. We just slide that in and make sure it fits okay. This is going to be glued in place, and this is also going to be what the Canard itself attaches to. This won't be the movable piece. This will just be the Canard. And what we'll do is we'll glue the foam piece, the Canard piece. We'll glue that, and that will just slide into the notches that are cut out. So what we'll do is make sure that the tube is lined up, and then we'll just slide that Canard right along the tube and line it up with the fuselage, and just line that right up, and it will lock right into the fuselage side. And once we've done that for both sides, we're going to take some epoxy, and just like the wing, we're going to put tape where we don't want the epoxy to touch, and make sure on the underside of the Canard. Once the Canard is dry and in place, we'll do this epoxy treatment, and this will just lock the foam onto this fiberglass piece. This may be a little much, but this will be under considerable stress, as the aircraft performs maneuvers. So we'll just take a bead of epoxy and let it run all over that carbon rod, and then we'll come back and just like the wing, we'll come back and scrape that off, and then we'll fill it with some lightweight filler. Now here's where we'll take the control surface of the Canard, and if you're using a foam one, you can just go ahead and run the foam, the 6mm rod. You can just run that across the back a couple times, and it will start to make, if you just kind of run it along the edge there, it will make an indentation, kind of a U shape into the foam. This will help us get a little more surface area when we glue it in place. So now what we're going to do is add the elevons to the back of the wing, and we do that simply by taking the elevon itself with our hinge, and I line that up with the back edge of the wing, and I'll just take my blade, and I will mark as each spot where the elevator is. What I'll do is I'll come back and I'll mark where those go, and then I will just make a small incision with my X-Acto knife, and it we don't really have to dig it out or anything, but I'll just mark on the wing surface where those hinges would be, and then I'll take the X-Acto knife and I will lay the blade pretty much flat, and it's the exact height that I need, and I will just make a small incision. I'll just work the blade back and forth a couple times. Like I said, I don't need to dig it out or make a huge opening. We actually want the friction of the foam to help with the glue to hold it in place. So I'll do that for all 4 hinges on each side. And you can see I just take the blade, I just slide in a little bit, and then work it just back and forth. And then I'll do it for the last one. And now what I'll do is just my normal foam glue. I will put that on each side of each hinge. Just a little bit. We want to make sure that any in this case, like my control horn or any extra work that need to be done on these, if we're using the foam or 3D printed or whatever, we want to make sure it's ready to mount. We won't be able to remove this later since we're gluing them in place. And there are other hinge options. There are removable hinges. There are some 3D printed ones you can download that you can detach, but in this case we're gluing this in place, and it will be there. And you just want to line it up and then get it pretty tight, but enough gaps so that there's movement. We want to just check the movement real quick, and then once we know that it works, then we'll do the same thing to the other side. The final step with the elevons then is installing the control linkage, and just whatever linkage you're using to connect it with. It may be a snap-on where the ends screw, or in this case I'm using the steel rod with a set screw. And I'll just make sure that these are, for now, just in place, and we can adjust this later when we tune our radio. And we just recessed the forward edge of the Canard elevator, so now we're going to glue the fuselage top in place. And that's, pretty simple. We're just going to apply glue everywhere where it touches. Again, you can see our wiring. We want to make sure that's all in place. Test your electronics definitely before you do this. Make sure that servos are working. Make sure that the EDF is blowing in the right direction. Make sure that your connections are correct. If you have to come back later and cut things apart, it's going to get messy. So just take a little bit of time and test everything once before you glue everything down. It's pretty final once we move on to the next few steps here. So everywhere where this is going to touch, I just put a bead of glue. I run that forward. The nice part about most of this glue is that you do have a little bit of working time. So you don't really have to rush. I mean, you have a few minutes for each part. So we're going to slide that into place. And you can see it really helps define the shape here. And fortunately, it fits the contours. And what we can do to make sure it stays, I'll pin it. I'll just put some pins from the inside of the fuselage. I'll pin it so that it's held in place. And I'll pin the front edge here, just to keep it at the right height so it doesn't start to droop or pop up. But we want to keep the contouring the same, and then we also want to keep it tight to the fuselage. So I'll put those pins in then from the inside. And then the rest of it's just going to press in place. And I am going to use a couple pins, but it will lock in place, with the cutouts that we have and the notches. But just to ensure that everything stays lined up and in place, I will put a couple pins. And then we can always come back and put weight on this, if it seems like it's not holding, staying down. And if you have the aft bulkhead, you would have that in place here. I waited, I'm going to put the 3D printed piece in, and I waited until this stage to add it, until this piece is in. I wanted it to be fairly secure when I added it to the back of the aircraft. So then I'll come back, and you can see my line, but I'll come back and I'll cut away that material. And this is gonna really help, both with the thrust tube, and also with shaping the aircraft later. And I would really, I can't stress enough, I would recommend, making sure you have your thrust tube ready at this point, while you have access to the back, and add your thrust tube as you're adding this piece in. It is a struggle to get into this space after you start to close it up. So I'm doing just a rough cut right now, I intentionally leaving too much space, because I don't want this to go too far forward. I know where it needs to be on the mark, but I also want to make sure that the piece lines up and fits. So you can see it looks pretty good with the fuselage top. And then what I'll do is I'll trim away a little bit on the side here on the bottom, and then I'll just trim the rest of the pieces off. And here I'm going to do a rough cut at this point. Just remove a section, and then I can start to get an idea of how this will actually fit. And once I have that, I can come back and I'm now pretty sure. So I just cut away the rest of the material and made sure it was square. And now for this, I'm going to use epoxy on the to glue the 3D printed part. I did this in lightweight PLA, so it's going to be really light for the size that it is. And I didn't use any infill, and two walls on the print. If you're wondering, and it's, like I said, lightweight PLA. The part's really light, and it will work fine with epoxy. I don't want it to fall off in flight, so I'm epoxying it in place. And what I'm going to do here is apply epoxy to the back surface, of all four parts. The bottom, the top, and then the two sides. And once I've applied, the epoxy on everything, and in some cases, maybe even a little too much epoxy. But this will fill any gaps or any imperfections that we have in our cut, and that will just slide right in. And you can see I missed the top, so I'm gonna make sure I get some epoxy on there. And we're using 15-minute epoxy, which in this case gives us about 5 minutes of working time before it starts to set up. And I just slide this piece in. And it's a tough, it's tough to hold it in place, but given the fact that it's only about 5 minutes and that it fits in pretty snug, there's not a lot of room for air, I just hold it and let it cure. And then while I have the epoxy out, I'm going to go ahead and glue the carbon rod on my forward Canard elevators. And I just put a bead of that in the groove that we made in the foam, or in this case a 3D printed elevator. I'm just going to mate that right to the carbon rod. And I'm going to give that a minute and wrap a piece of tape around it and let it dry. And now we're going to put the Canard elevators into the fuselage itself. So I had glued two support tubes in place with a gap in the middle where it can, the servo can get to a control horn. What I'll do is I'll take a control horn with the center drilled out, and I will put that in the middle, and I will slide the Canard elevator into the tube and make sure it goes, it'll feed then through the control horn, and then it will come out the other side. And I'll line that up so that the control horn is at 90 degrees. And you can see there I've got it about right. And what we'll do then is take, verify that it's moving freely and there's no resistance, no friction. We don't want to glue the carbon tube or any of that to the Canard itself. We want this portion, the Canard elevator, to stay independent. Then I'm going to take the other Canard elevator, I'm going to apply glue into the groove for the carbon tube, and instead of trying to do, prop everything up, I'm going to turn the elevator down 90 degrees so that it's a right angle to the Canard, into the airframe. And then I'm going to take this piece and also, at a 90-degree angle, I'm going to place it onto the airframe. And what we'll end up with, is the pressure of the aircraft will hold that in place on the carbon tube. And now we can glue on the angled fuselage sides and then the vertical stabilizer. And what we're going to do here is put glue on all the surfaces of the one side. So the top fuselage piece there, and then the fuselage side, those are going to have an angle cut into them. And if we look at the cutout drawing, when we cut it out, we'll see that there's a dashed line that shows what the angle should be. So we'll make sure that that's trimmed pretty close. And you can see it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. This, as long as it's close, we can glue this in place and then attach it. And also remember that I had added the 3D printed tail section, so I need to trim the sides for that as well. So I'm gonna smear the glue so that I don't end up with a lot of runs, and I'm gonna smear it so it covers that whole surface. And then what I'll do, once that's all smeared out and I've got it pretty evenly dispersed, I'm going to take the side piece, I'm just going to lay it in place, and then I'll start putting pins in, and this will require a lot of pins. This is curved and it's angled, so we'll just pin it and make sure, as we look from the top down, that we don't see any big gaps. And if we do, we'll come back and we'll pin it, or we'll readjust. And I, again, put the pins at an angle. This is under a little bit of pressure, so I try to put the pins at a slight angle, front to back, so that it puts a little bit of force to hold it down, so that it doesn't just pull off of the foam. And this creates a pressure, so the more it pushes against the pin, the more pressure there is to hold it in place. You can see I didn't quite trim enough, so I'll trim the last little bit off right up against the 3D printed part. There's a little bit of a gap here, so I'm going to repin it. And once we've done both sides, at this point we want to sand this before we put the turtle deck on. And this goes really quick, especially if you've got the 3D printed part in the back as a guide. But even if you don't, I just take a little bit of sandpaper and I fold it over and I start knocking down the edge. And as I do that, it starts to actually, even though it's a kind of a beveled shape, you start to get a very round shape developing out of this, and you can see even in fast time, it really doesn't take much time. I mean, the whole process probably takes 15 minutes to sand this to shape, maybe even less. And it's not really as much work. It's really a matter of how much you want. You can, this is your aircraft, right? It'll fly, sanded or not. So make it yours and take it to the level that you want it to be at. And once we've sanded both sides and we're pretty happy with that, we're going to add the vertical stabilizer. And that just has it notches in place. Again, it's better to sand this ahead of time. The leading edge, if you're going to put, a balsa leading edge on, a trailing edge, do all that before you put it on the aircraft. But I just, again, place glue on it, and then I slide it into the slot just like it's a puzzle piece. And on this next step, we're going to add the fuselage angled sides with their supports, and then we're also going to add the top deck. And a trick to adding this is, you can see I have marks. What I'm going to do is first make sure that they line up, but if you place the top piece flat onto the deck, you can trace around that with a pen or a pencil, and I trace with just a fine line just along the edge like this. And what that does is it gives me a guide for the bottom piece, and it really lets me see the where it has to curve and how it should fit in. So then what I can do is take my side piece here, and once I apply glue, and I'm going to actually do it a little bit different on this one. I'm going to apply the glue just on the inside of the line. The line is where I want the outer edge of this piece to be. So I know that all along the edge here, all along this line is where we'll actually glue it down. And then we'll also want to glue the back of that bulkhead. I get my pins ready and I place it down, and this is going to be, again, a piece that's under a little bit of tension. So what I'll do, is I'll put the pins kind of at an angle through the side down into the fuselage, and I'll come and I'll push just until I see the line, and make sure that I'm just on the inside of that line. And as I push this down, you'll see it's under some force, because we actually added in that second piece, that the top edge of kind of a reinforcement, and also, when we come back and we shape it, we're going to sand into that, so it's a little more rigid than normal. And also with the rudder, the vertical stabilizer, I wasn't so concerned with keeping that exactly 90 degrees. I'm going to get a lot of help with that as we add these next three pieces, the two sides and then the top deck, are going to line that up straight. So I've added both sides, and I've made sure that I've got, a smooth edge across the top, to glue the turtle deck, the top to. Then I'm going to put a bead of glue down on each side. And what we'll end up doing is, once we've smeared that out, we make sure everything's covered. And I just smear it around with the tip of the glue bottle. You could use a piece of foam or a wood stick. I just smear it around. And then once we've got this all smeared out, we'll take the turtle deck, and we know it fits. It should line up with these foam pieces directly below it. And we'll just take that, and we will slide it right on place. What we want to make sure of is that it stays in place, it doesn't move on the sides, so we're going to put some pins in to hold it both down onto the sides, as well as keeping the sides kind of straight underneath it. We don't want them to wobble in, or to be a little lopsided from side to side, so we'll just pin that again, pins at an angle, and I'll do that on both sides. We're in the final stage of the build. We're going to install either the 3mm Depron intakes, and then we're also going to install the bottom piece, or the belly panel. In this case, again, I'm using a 3D printed part, and I'm just going to glue that and then line it up. And you can see here, there's a slight gap, and I don't want to trim the foam away. I want this to be where it's at. I want it to be proportional on both sides, and you can see, as I put a little pressure on it, the gap goes away, but still there is a gap. But I can come back with filler and fix that later. We also have a little more sanding to do, so there won't really be an issue. To hold this in place, it's kind of tricky. I could tape it. I don't really want it to slide around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it with quite a bit of force and hold it in place, and then I'm going to put a pin in the front, not through the plastic, but I'm putting the pin through the foam, and that'll just keep the pressure on it to hold it. And then I'll do that, for the other side. So now we're going to put the bottom panel in place, and this is going to add a major layer of protection to the bottom of the aircraft. It's also going to give us just a little bit of shape definition on the bottom as well when it's done. So I just, put glue all over the surface of this, and then, line it up front to back. And I do pin it, you see just off camera, I'm pinning the front, and then I also pin the back just to keep it from sliding, left to right, keep it lined up in the center. And then rather than relying on the weight of the aircraft itself, or just, a couple pins to hold it in place, I'll actually come back with some weight. And here I'm just using a couple batteries, and I'm just going to keep some pressure on. And then it's time to sand. And again, you could fly the aircraft as it is, but I'm just going to take some sandpaper, and I start working just like we did on the layer below it. This top part a little more aggressively. It doesn't have the angled piece that we had below. So I'm just going to come back, and I'm going to start trimming. And I'm using the bulkhead that's coming up, for the hatch, the aft cockpit there. I'm using that as a guide to get the curvature, and starting from the front where that is, and just getting that kind of to shape, and then I'll start to carry that shape all the way to the back, and it will slowly transition out, but I just continue to work at this, and you'll see, again, it goes a lot faster than you'd expect. The foam just burns away pretty quick, and we're using a 180 and a 220 sandpaper to get this shaped appropriately and not end up with too rough of a finish. And once we've sanded the whole aircraft, where we think we're at a point where we're ready to really finish it up, I come back with some lightweight, filler. You can use a balsa filler or a lightweight spackle, but we want to make sure it's a lightweight, filler, or a foam filler or a balsa filler. And I just use a piece of foam. It has a soft edge, and I just trawl that, over this, just about everything. I just run a bead of that, on the end. I just keep filling it up, keeping in mind that we're going to remove probably 90% of what we put on the aircraft, with this filler. So what I'm looking to do is cover any dings, any rough surfaces, any scratches, from the build process, and leave a nice smooth finish. So I just run a bead over that, and then I use, my finger, and I just put a nice, to get a nice round curve, where maybe the vertical stabilizer, meets the airframe, or the canards, or the wing, meets the fuselage. And I just get a nice bead, a nice fine line, and any cracks I want to fill, any imperfections, and I do this over the entire aircraft, and I do it again over the bottom as well. And once I've done that and I've sanded the aircraft again, I might do it a couple times, But once I'm happy with the finish, now we're going to protect it. I'm going to use this Polycrylic, which is a water-based polyurethane, and I'm just going to use a foam brush, and I'm going to brush the entire aircraft, even over the 3D printed parts. And I'm just going to brush over the entire aircraft with the polycrylic. Anywhere where, you know, there's exposed foam, or uh, you know, the hatch opening, around those areas. This will do a number of things. One, it will protect the surface significantly. Two, it will also harden the foam up a little bit, just enough to make it a little less prone to dings and damage. And I just brush that all over the surface. And I'll actually put on about 5 or 6 coats of this, and I will, after the second coat, then I'll come back with like a 400 grit sandpaper or 600 grit sandpaper, and I'll work my way up to 600 grit before I spray the aircraft. And on this particular aircraft, it has a lot of exposed, bottom surface that will come in contact with the ground. I'm going to add a layer of half-ounce glass cloth, and I won't use, any kind of resin. I'll just use the polycrylic, the water-based polyurethane, and I'll start in the center. First I'll lay the material over the whole plane, and then I'll kind of give it a rough trim. And then what I'll do is I'll start kind of in the center here, and I'll just start dabbing, the polycrylic, and I'll work my way from the center, outwards, and I'll pull out any air bubbles, brush those down. But as I start brushing, you can see it just almost becomes transparent, and we just keep brushing over the surface. And this is going to give us a really rigid, bottom that will really resist, both transport and, landings in maybe less than perfect, grass. Any kind of harder surface that's going to come in contact with, we might just get a scuff or something in the paint. We won't lose the chunks of foam. So this just gets brushed. Again, you see it's just brushing over it, and as it dries, it will just harden up and stick to the airframe. And what I'll actually do is, after the first coat here, I will brush a second coat to fill it, any of the gaps. You'll get like kind of a weave-like texture to it. You could also come back with your lightweight filler and fill that. I prefer to use the polycrylic, just because I don't like the way that the filler looks once it's painted. You'll see kind of filler through the paint. It'll show up as a slightly different color or texture than the polyurethane. But at any rate, I do this over the whole bottom of the aircraft. You could do it over the entire aircraft in some models. It's going to add some weight, but not a lot. But like I said, it really toughens up the aircraft. You could do it over, at the very least, leading edges and maybe the center strip on the bottom. But again, this is a pretty big wing area, pretty flat bottom, so I'm just doing the whole bottom surface. And then as it starts to cure, it'll start to harden relatively quickly. As it does that, what I'll do is I'll come back with an X-Acto knife, or a hobby blade, and I will trim away the excess material. And once we've, finished with the polycrylic, we've sanded it, we've polycrylic, sanded, repeat, I then come back and I prime, the entire aircraft, top and bottom. And you can see in this, I used a 70mm engine. I added cheater holes, and I can come back with a 3D printed part. Once I've done the primer, I've gone back and I've touched up any imperfections. You can see I've sanded it a little, smoothed the surface out. I can come back and I can actually do a finished paint job. And then in this case, I'm going to do a camouflage finish, Swedish camouflage, typical of the Viggens of the era. I'll just start with one of my lighter colors and just kind of spray loosely, and then I'll tape it off, and I'll just keep adding the colors to it and getting it where it needs to go. You could rattle can this, just with spray paint. You could leave it gray. You don't even have to paint it, but you could brush paint it too. And now that we have the aircraft mostly finished, I've 3D printed a detailed cockpit and used a clear canopy, so I saved this for the end just so I wouldn't ruin it. But we're going to affix magnets on the hatch to hold it in place. And I just press these into the foam, and they will leave kind of an indentation where they are. And once I've left that, I'll do 2 in the front and 1 in the back. Once I've done that, I'll come back with my X-Acto blade, and I will trim out that little indentation and just cut out a little notch big enough for the magnet to fit in, and I'll just pluck the center out that I trim out, and I'll do that all 3 spots. And then once we've created a spot for the magnet, I'll come back with some glue, and you could use epoxy. I initially use the foam glue, but then I'll come back as that's setting up, and I'll add a little bit of CA over the top of that just to hold it in place. I don't want the magnets to come out, especially in flight. And I'll do that, like I said, 2 in the front to hold it down, and then 1 in the back. And I'll just glue those in. And once those are glued in, I'll line up the magnets that are going into the fuselage. I'll put those in place, all 3 of them, the 1 in the back and the 2 in the front. And I'll take that hatch and I'll press it down into place on the aircraft. And when I do that, it's going to leave that same kind of indentation in the foam, in the magnet tray on the aircraft. And then I'll do the same thing I did to the hatch. I'll just come back and I'll just kind of cut around the little indentation and then pluck out the little bit of foam that I've cut out. And I'll do that in all 3 spots. And then I will, apply the glue and put the replacement, the magnet in. The one thing that you do have to just 100% be sure of is that the magnet is the right polarity. So I take the magnet directly off the hatch, or the cockpit assembly, depending on where the location is, and I will take that magnet directly off and I will place it in the same position right into the hole that I've cut out. And I triple check the magnet polarity, because there's nothing that's worse than having the magnet go in the wrong direction, and then your hatch won't stand. So with that, the aircraft will be completely finished and ready for flight. Thank you for watching, and enjoy your build.